Did you ever fly in the Goodyear Blimp?
Oh, I did. When I first started with Goodyear, one of the things that they do for you is give you what they call a familiarization ride. I was so excited. I can't begin to tell you. But I was a little nervous, too, because it was unlike any other aircraft I'd ever flown in. And I've been in, small private planes, small private jets, commercial airliners, helicopters. The blimp flies totally differently than anything else. They used to call them sky yachts for a very good reason. You're basically suspended in the air. It is propeller powered, but you're basically the sensation is like being in a boat. You're very gently rocked by the winds around you. It's a very gentle, very slow ride. But when I got into the gondola, I was sitting in the right front seat next to the pilot, and everything was fine until the blimp took off and left the ground. And all of a sudden, I couldn't see the ground. All I could see was the nose of the blimp and blue sky, and it was such a rush. I just shut my eyes until the blimp leveled off. And after that, it was just a fabulous experience. It was just, you're flying at only about 1,500 feet above the ground, so you get a really good look at what's around you. And again, the sensation is very gentle. You can feel the blimp responding to the winds. It was a really different experience from anything I'd ever had before, but I loved every minute of it.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of Shaping Opinion, we're joined by Elizabeth Flynn. She's a public relations veteran, and for several years she managed public relations for the Goodyear Blimp. Today we're going to tell the story of the blimp and why it remains one of America's most beloved marketing symbols. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. So buckle your seatbelts and turn off all electronic devices except the one you're listening to for this episode, because we're about to take flight with the Goodyear Blimp. You yourself, Elizabeth, you have done many things in public relations. One of them is that you managed public relations for the Goodyear Blimp. Can you tell us when you started with the Goodyear Blimp and how long you handled PR and what that involved?
I started with Goodyear in January of 2011, and I had never had any clients that were involved in air travel or that sort of thing. I had flown myself. I took flying lessons in fixed wing many years ago, but this was totally unique because the Goodyear Blimp is probably the best known corporate icon in the world. And anybody that looks at the ship, you become a 10-year-old all over again. There's something very magical about a blimp because there's so few anymore.
The first Goodyear Blimp was the Pilgrim, and that used helium rather than hydrogen, which is flammable.
The Pilgrim in 1925 was Goodyear's first airship that was devoted to advertising, but that wasn't Goodyear's first blimp. There were multiple other blimps built and operated by Goodyear they started building in 1919, and by 1920, there were 5 Goodyear blimps in operation, and they were already starting to use them for marketing purposes, not to the extent that they did with the Pilgrim. But, for example, there was a pony blimp based out in what they call a pony blimp, based out in Los Angeles, that they used to use they delivered tires to Mary Pickford at her house using the pony blimp. So I think way back in the very beginning, they already had an eye to, what kind of a unique impact might this airship have on our tire business.
Paul Litchfield was described as the visionary for behind the blimp. Can you tell me a little bit about Paul Litchfield and his vision for the blimp back in the 1920s?
I think Paul Litchfield, he was a visionary and a showman, a combination of the two. Back in 1920 and forward, airships the world was fascinated by these big ships that they were starting to develop. And again, flight was in its very early days. It was a novelty, and everyone was captivated by what might become of air transportation as a result of these airships. And so you had a lot of the Goodyear Blimps, for example, would go on out and visit small towns. People would, hundreds of people would come out just to see them in operation. And there was nothing else like it. And Litchfield, he caught on to that very quickly and realized that there was a way through these little barnstorming adventures to get people fully invested in Goodyear itself and to buy products. And nobody else had come up with that concept prior to this. And it's really to his credit that it took off. The other thing that happened is that the Goodyear blimps, from the pony blimps forward, in addition to being used as advertising tools, they started working with Hollywood, and they were appearing in films. And so everywhere you turned, you were exposed to the Goodyear blimp by virtue of the association to Goodyear products. It really, it put the company on the map in so many different ways, and it outpaced the competition because there wasn't anything else like it.
The Pilgrim was the first, as you said, to use helium. According to the research that I did, by the time it was retired in 1931, they said it had made 4,765 flights and already carried 5,355 passengers and covered 94,974 miles. So that's quite a bit in those days. If you would compare that to any other type of flight, that was quite a bit of time in the air. For over 90 years since then, as you mentioned, blimps have flown thousands and thousands of miles bearing the Goodyear brand name in some of the biggest events in the world. But today, Goodyear airships really are not blimps, are they?
They're still fondly and affectionately called the Goodyear blimps, both inside the company as well as by the general public. But technically, they are a dirigible. They are a semi-rigid airship. The difference between the original Goodyear blimps and today's two airships, Wingfoot 1 and Wingfoot 2, is the internal structure. The blimps had two ballonets inside, which are basically big airbags surrounded by the envelope. And the space in between the two ballonets was occupied by the helium, which gives it its lift. The new airships and the shape of the blimp was maintained simply by the cut of the envelope and the inflation with helium. The new airships, the semi-rigids, actually have an internal skeleton that's made of carbon fiber. It's extremely lightweight, but that's what gives the new ships their shape.
And what's the story behind the actual name of the word blimp?
There are multiple, there are two trains of thought. One is the old saw that somebody way back in the day plinked their finger against the skin of the blimp and it made a blimp sound. That's actually not correct, though. The airship classification way back in the day was B-limp. It was a classification that referred to the type of aircraft it was. And so obviously it was B-limp, and it was shortened to blimp. But a lot of people still believe the fairy tale about somebody, poking the ship and the sound that it made. But it's actually an old designation for the type of airship. that it was, the type of aircraft.
Yeah, the urban legend, I suppose, that I heard was that a lieutenant in Great Britain's Royal Navy Air Force coined that term in the way that you just described. Yeah. One way or the other, the name stuck. And the blimps have been used not only during World War I, but also World War II. Goodyear also got involved in the World War II effort. Can you describe that?
Oh, Goodyear had a tremendous role in World War II. At the outset of World War II, Goodyear had 5 advertising blimps in operation. All 5 of those ships were basically taken over by the United States Navy, as were all the pilots. And that was the beginning of the Navy's fleet. Subsequent to that, Goodyear started building airships for the United States Navy and built well over 100 airships that were in operation throughout World War II. They were primarily used for coastal patrols and for escorting ship convoys. The best thing about that whole thing is that for any convoy that was escorted by a Goodyear blimp, not one ship was ever lost. They took that responsibility quite seriously and very proudly.
Well, that's just more to the legend of the blimp, but we all think of the blimp typically for marketing purposes. We know that the blimp has covered Super Bowls, NASCAR, horse races, golf tournaments. What surprised me when I first saw it is when the blimp was used to cover an indoor event like a hockey Stanley Cup final or a NCAA tournament, but they still use it. Can you tell me more about that?
The first aerial transmission of coverage, live coverage from an airship, was actually the Rose Bowl out in Pasadena.
Really?
It was. And Goodyear has had an association with both the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl, basically, since the 50s. That's really where it all got started. And again, there was a novelty value, if you will, of having a blimp provide aerial coverage for these types of events. And producers loved it because it gave them a point of view that wasn't available any other way. And again, there was a lot of crowd excitement seeing the ship overhead. So it just added to the whole cachet of the public's recognition of these events and appreciation for them. And it gave it a nice boost, if you will, in terms of audience appreciation. In fact, with the Rose Parade, Goodyear has covered the Rose Parade every year now since I think it was 1955. An interesting thing about Goodyear, its coverage associations with the networks, is that it's all done on a handshake. It's not a formal written contract. That's very unusual in this day and age. People are so conscious of contractual obligations and this and that and the other thing, but Goodyear has always done these type of things on, the promise. If we can get the ship up, if weather's permitting, we'll be there. We'll give you what you're looking for. That's very unique in this day and age.
It sure is. The blimp is now part of pop culture. What movies has it been in, and how has it affected Hollywood?
Well, the blimps basically were born, if you will, at pretty much the same time that Hollywood first got off the ground. The blimps were there when Hollywood was still filming in celluloid. So, and again, because it was such a novelty, it was a star, an unscripted, often unscripted and certainly uncredited star in a lot of different films. The first one was Jack Pickford starred in a film called Just Out of College, and this was back in 1920. And they used one of Goodyear's pony blimps in Los Angeles for staging the scenes in here. And the Goodyear blimps have been in, oh my gosh, so many different films. Trying to think of some of the biggest ones. One of them was the movie Help with the Beatles. There was a movie, there were lots of wartime films, and of course there's always Black Sunday, which everybody remembers.
1977, that was the movie where actually the blimp was part of the story of the movie, where in the story the blimp was hijacked.
It was the blimp was hijacked and used to, supposedly it was going to bomb the Super Bowl stadium during the Super Bowl.
That's one of the few times that the blimp may have not been one of the good guys in a movie.
Exactly. It was in Gone in 60 Seconds, in the Beatles movie Hell Barn Correspondence with Hitchcock, Hidden Valley with Monogram Pictures way back in the 30s, Scarface, that was a pivotal scene in the very end of Scarface with the Goodyear Blimp. It was in View to a Kill very shortly for In View of the Kill, a couple episodes of Cheers at the end, The Nanny. You know, it really has had quite a career, and I think it deserves its own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame.
You describe it like it's its own personality. If you had to describe it, being so close to it as you've been, what is the personality of the blimp? Why is it so likable?
You know, for the crews that work with the airship, our entire professional life and into our own personal lives, it all revolves around the care and maintenance of that airship. It was like our baby, if you will. We all experienced what we would call blimp dreams, where you become so focused on protecting the airship, making sure that, you know, she's well maintained, that we don't take unnecessary risks flying or in bad weather, for example, and that sort of thing. And so most of us, the whole time that we were working with the ships, would have periodic what we called blimp dreams, and everybody could understand. When you'd walk in and, I had a blimp dream last night, everybody would just nod their heads and go, yeah, I know.
You also mentioned another term when we had talked before, and that is the blimp effect.
The blimp effect. The blimp effect is, it's a term that was given in California at the Carson base to what happens when 1 million commuters who are on the 405 freeway are trying to go north and south on the freeway, and the blimp is on the mast, or she's in general operations and she's coming in and out. Traffic on the 405 comes to a complete standstill, and because everybody's watching the blimp. And it becomes a big parking lot. And we used to get a lot of phone calls from people who were furious with us about, working the blimp because they had to get somewhere.
To me, when you mentioned that the blimp could use its own star on Hollywood and why it's so beloved, it seems to me that we're conditioned. We associate the blimp with some of the best times in our own lives. We associate it with that Super Bowl Sunday, which is always a holiday in America. Or we associate it with these big sporting events that are celebratory events for the entire country. So the blimp is always associated with very good things that are sort of part of the national story, the narrative of America. Wouldn't you think that's part of what is the persona of the blimp?
Yes. In fact, it's so much so that we finally came to a point where when we would be covering some of these more well-known events, we developed the term blimp-worthy. It's a blimp-worthy event. Because the blimps, the 3 blimps that Goodyear was operating when I was with them, there was no way that we could possibly cover everything. So no matter how many requests we would get from the different networks or the teams or, the different production teams to cover an event, we really had to sit down and evaluate from a travel perspective, can we provide coverage reasonably at a reasonable cost to the company and accomplish what everybody wants, which is the high visibility, the spectacular camera work that comes from the camera crews on board the ship. And so logistically, it became a point of pride for a lot of networks to say, this is a blimp-worthy event. The Goodyear blimp is going to be there.
Blimpworthy is sort of a rallying cry, isn't it, for marketing and the work involved with doing public relations for the blimp. What would you say is the number one job of the PR person handling PR for the blimp?
My job was not typical of what most PR people do. A lot of what I did was go out and develop business for the blimp. Even though we were known for covering specific types of events, my thought when I joined Goodyear was that there was a lot more business out there that we hadn't tapped into yet. So, for example, where we would cover college football and the NBA, Major League Baseball, sporting events, NASCAR, obviously, and an HRA, horse racing, we were known for doing that, and golfing. But there was another, being based in California. One of the things that I immediately started looking into was, what's the entertainment community doing out here, and how can we help? So I went after new business with, for example, Jimmy Kimmel and their summer concert series, and we used to provide coverage to Jimmy Kimmel for when he'd have Lady Gaga there, Paul McCartney, the big stars where they would close down the Hollywood Boulevard. And then we started doing more and more red carpet events, the Golden Globes. We had done the Oscars prior, but it hadn't necessarily been happening every year. And so I was very happy to tap into the zeitgeist in Hollywood with the Christmas parade, some of the local events that really made a big difference in what we were able to provide advertisers, if you will, that sort of piggybacked on the Goodyear Blimp being there.
What are some of the questions that you would get most often when it came to the blimp?
How can I get a ride? That was always number one. Please, can I have a ride? The passengers that we flew were corporate guests. They were primarily clients of Goodyear tire dealers, for example. But we also would fly, and this is a side of Goodyear and the blimp story that a lot of people don't know. The general public can't ride. It's by invitation only. It doesn't mean we don't take up members of the general public, but they also tend to fall into very special categories. For example, I used to get a lot of letters and phone calls from people who had a young child who had a terminal illness or an adult who was dying of cancer, and it was part of their bucket list. And we would do that very quietly. We wouldn't make any big deal out of it, but we would make arrangements to have that individual accompanied by a friend or a family member, if a doctor signed off on it, mind you. But as long as we got a physician's clearance to take them up, that it wouldn't affect them adversely, at altitude, we would take them up and give them their bucket list. And it was very heartwarming but heartbreaking at the same time to know that you were giving this individual and their family and friends a happy memory.
You were making a difference.
We did make a difference. We also would donate a pair of rides, a pair of seats, to charities all over the country for auctioning. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of dollars raised by auctioning off seats for these, bucket list rides on the Goodyear Blimp. And we also used to devote whole days to flying military members. We would have the Navy there one day, Army the next, we'd have the Marines, the Coast Guard, and so we were always trying to find ways to give back.
Why haven't other companies had the same success with their blimps, those who've tried it?
I think Goodyear's advantage is multiple. One, we have more experience than anybody else in operating airships. Secondly, we are better capitalized than just about anybody else. People that get involved in airship operations, the companies that are no longer in operation, I think their biggest drawback has been capitalization. It takes a lot of money to operate an airship.
The numbers that I saw says it cost $20 million to buy a blimp, and that does not include storage, ground support, staffing, maintenance, fuel, which the estimates there are $5 million a year to operate. So in one of the marketing publications that covered this, they said, well, if you were to buy one Super Bowl ad, it might cost you $4 million. Do you think that it's worth $5 million a year for Goodyear to have a blimp program?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why it's lasted almost 100 years. Goodyear, this is something that a lot of people don't understand about Goodyear's advertising program as well. The marketing department at Goodyear oversees most contracts, if you will. It ties in with the overall advertising budget that they're devoting in other areas. So the airship, the aerial coverage that we provide with the blimp, there's no cash exchange. This is basically a barter. We provide the networks or the event organizers with aerial coverage in exchange for what we call a blimp pop. So for every hour of aerial coverage that the ship provide, the network, and we're talking television here, obviously, the network then compensates Goodyear by airing a 10-second, what we call a blimp pop. And you've probably seen it. It runs along the lower third of the screen, and it's just an illustration of the blimp crossing from left to right. There's a live announcer voiceover, and there's generally some sort of little blip of signage, down at the at the end of the spot. The pop is like a catchphrase for the event or the type of event that we're covering. When you're covering a championship bowl game, those blimp pops are, great compensation to the company for the exposure, and it does not cost us what it would cost any other advertiser to run a 10-second ad.
An event that can say the blimp is covering it adds a certain value to the event itself. It tells the viewer that this is a special day.
It does. And it's interesting. When I first started with Goodyear, when I first started going out in the field, my job when I would accompany the airship, and we all did, the entire crew, whenever we were out on the road, everybody went except for the receptionist back at the base, because we all had specific jobs to do with the ship. But my role, for example, it wasn't glamorous at all. I was usually sitting underneath one of the TV trucks by a tire with a headset on and communicating via radio up to the airship to help them line up their shots or to tell them what the director, to supplement the directions that the director was giving. And so it wasn't as glamorous as people might think it is. There was a lot of really, unusual circumstances. If I got lucky in the summertime, I'd be inside one of the TV trucks where there was air conditioning. Otherwise, I was just melting down by the tires.
Are you still associated with the blimp, or can you describe your current status with the blimp?
Well, I retired from Goodyear in late 2014, but once you work with these airships and these crews, they're your family. I'm still in very close contact with many colleagues at corporate. I am still, very much involved with the airship industry overall. I've helped edit a couple different books that have been published on airships in general.
Can you describe your best day with the Goodyear blimp?
My best day. There were so many of them. I'd be hard-pressed to single out one day. That job was an absolute joy for me. I loved my work. I loved working with the networks. I loved interacting with the people that would come to the base just to watch the ship on the mast. I loved working with the military with Toys for Tot. I enjoyed meeting people that were part of our tire dealership community. I really can't think of a bad day, period. every day was something a little bit different from another, but the underlying theme is that everybody I came into contact with loved my ship.
Elizabeth Flynn, thank you for joining us today. It was fun.
Oh, it was. Thanks so much for having me, Tim.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a complete bio on our guest, Elizabeth Flynn, and you'll get links to some of the great articles on the history of the blimp we discussed. You can also listen to other episodes. And don't miss the next episode. You can subscribe to Shaping Opinion in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find at shapingopinion.com. This is where we talk about the people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.